Continuing on with Chapter 8 notes. On page 229 we have this graph here, and it's an extremely important graph. Look, I put 4 stars because it's very, very important. The AP test will probably ask you about this graph. I will definitely ask you about this graph on your test. And so let's talk about it. Let's learn how to interpret it. Every country goes through 4 stages of demographic transition. This is pre-industrial stage, and you'll notice the birth and death rates are both high. Then what happens is that a country starts to become industrialized. And in industrialization, there's better food, better healthcare, better technologies that keep people alive. So the death rate drops. But people still have a lot of babies because they don't. It takes about 20 years for people to realize the death rate has dropped. See, people here have a lot of babies because there's a lot of births and a lot of deaths. For the U.S., this most likely was all the way up until around the early 1900s. So all throughout the 17 and 1800s, people had a lot of children, and they expected a lot of them to die from childhood diseases like measles, smallpox, polio, and just accidents or infections. And then in the early 1900s, we developed vaccines, and in the 1940s, we developed antibiotics, and it dropped the death rate dramatically. We also have a higher food supply than we used to. It takes about 20 years before people realize, we don't need to have as many children because they're not dying. I don't need to have 5, 7 children so that 2 or 3 stay alive. So after about 20 years, people stop having as many children. And part of this includes education for women and access to birth control. So the population now declines until you have both low and death rates in the post-industrial stage. So you need to know all 4 stages and what happens to the birth and death rates in each of these 4 stages and why does the birth and death rate go up or down. Make sure you understand this. The next term is not in your book, but it is on the AP test. Population momentum. Excuse me. It takes a generation for 0% growth. And it has to do with this big bubble area here. You have this huge population increase, which we can also refer to as population momentum. Because here, I'm sorry, I was wrong about that. This big area here is not population momentum. After you have 0% growth here, which is your post-industrial stage, is at 0% growth. It still takes a generation to hit your 0% growth because the current generation that is large has to have children. So after you hit post-industrial stage, you've still got a bunch of kids that were born here, and they've all got to have their children. And maybe it is only 2 children now. But here it was more like 4 or 5. So again, population momentum, it takes a generation is 20 years, for 0% growth rate after you hit this stage, because the current generation has to have children. And once they're done having children, then you're going to hit 0% growth. When we talk about growth rates, we have what's called a crude growth rate that does not include migration. If you include migration, then you have your actual growth rate. So if you're just talking birth and death rates, you're talking your crude growth rate. All right, on the next page, we have here causes of fertility decline in Bangladesh. It's an important article, but there really isn't anything you need to know on specifically about Bangladesh on the AP test. Turning the page, we have a couple graphs here that really focus on equality for women. Sorry, let me find the section that it's under. It's under Women's Empowerment Greatly Affects Population Growth Rates. So there's a couple of ways to reduce population growth. First of all, the most important way to reduce a country's population growth is to provide education for women. The second way is to lower infant mortality. If women know their children are going to stay alive, they won't have as many children. But this, and again, that sounds kind of weird, but a lot of women want to make sure they have children and their children grow up. So they will have several children if they expect one or two or three to die. They, again, want to make sure they have children to take care of them in their old age, or just because people want to have children. And so they know that some will die, so they'll have several to account for that. But the biggest way to reduce population growth is to have education for women. Education for women, which includes equality and freedom, give you lower fertility rates because it allows girls to marry later because they're still in school. They can also earn their own money, which means that they don't have to be married off by their families at age 15 or 16 or 17 and start having babies right away. With education, girls can get a job. They can make their own money. They're not dependent on a husband for survival. And both of these lower your total fertility rate. And overall in the country, if a girl doesn't get married at 16, but instead she has education and she gets married at 20, then she'll end up having less children. Instead of 10, she might only have 5, or even less than that. So these are these are very important reasons why education for women is extremely important and is the number one way to reduce population growth. Over here is a list of countries that show which countries have the most representation in government, and Sweden is first. 234 and 235. All right, so going on to 235, and this is under population policies and family planning. We have here that poorer nations usually have a higher total fertility rate and growth rates. And then another part of the chapter that's actually not in your book, but you need to know it, is there's 2 ways we measure the quality of life. We measure quality of life based on how long you're expected to live, which is your life expectancy, and the infant mortality rate. So if you have both of these that are good numbers, high life expectancy, low infant mortality rate, then they say the quality of life in that country is good.